Gardening is universal. No matter where we live, what we grow, or how we garden, we share the same instinct to nurture something and watch it flourish. With more than 3 decades in the garden industry, Paul Zimmerman explores the passion that connects gardeners around the world with those who also live in it. Drawing on years of travel, conversations with international growers and hobby gardeners, and countless visits leading garden tours everywhere from France to England to New Zealand. Paul looks beyond the how-to and dives into the deeper questions. Why do we garden? What's changing in the gardening world? And what does it reveal about who we are? Please welcome your host, Paul Zimmerman.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of A World of Gardening. Hope you're enjoying the podcast. I'm getting some nice feedback on it. As always, please go to the source of the podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon, all the various Podbean, the various places. Like the podcast, leave a review, hopefully positive. That would be appreciated. Those all help. They really do help a lot. And if you have an idea for a podcast you'd like me to do, pop me an email. Paul@paulzimmermanroses.com. That's the easiest way to do it. Love to hear your ideas and your thoughts and see if we can do something that works for you guys. We have a fun podcast today with Jason Crouch and Matt Douglas, but I'll talk more about that in just a little bit before I introduce them. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in my own garden. This is the part of the podcast we call Paul's Journal. My roses are actively growing again. If you've been reading my newsletter, and I've talked in a couple other podcasts, the nights are turning cooler. We've had lots of rain. So with them actively growing, I'm going to clean up dead wood. I'm going to groom them a little bit, set them up for fall is basically what I'm beginning to do right now. I am fertilizing again. No time release, not this time of year. We don't want to be pushing growth into winter. That's if you live somewhere with the true winter where you get hard freezes and frosts or snow or something like that. If you're in a southern climate, you can use time release right now if you're not going to get a freeze. In fact, you're probably starting to come into your better bloom season, I would think, in fall and winter. I know a lot of people in Southern California. When I lived in Los Angeles, I hear from people in Florida, certainly, Texas, the desert areas. Winter is actually a very good time for you. So go ahead and get the roses waking up and let them fertilize again. So those are my basic notes of what's going on in my garden. The podcast, we really got into it and went a little longer than I'd anticipated, but it's got some good stuff. So I'm going to keep Paul's journal a little bit tight. But before I go, there's a couple people we lost in the rose world this past week that I just want to just acknowledge who they were. One of them, Wendy Morstein Tilley. She had a wonderful business. She would be at Rose Society conventions and the American Rose Society conventions. And she had a business that sold gloves and signs and all kinds of wonderful things. And what she was just always a great president and a great ambassador for the rose. She just really had a true passion for what she did. And sadly, she passed away. So we were sorry to lose Wendy. The other person I'd like to acknowledge that passed away is Kara Hanna, wife of Ben Hanna. Kara and Ben owned Heirloom Roses. They purchased it from Louise Clemens back in the day. Ben was certainly the face of Heirloom Roses, maybe more so than Kara, but Kara was also a huge part of Heirloom Roses. She was a guiding force and certainly a guiding light. So just wanted to say we're sorry to see the loss of Wendy and Kara, and certainly think of their families. Keep them in your thoughts and prayers as we move forward. But I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that we lost two really lovely people in the rose world today. Today's show, interesting. This is something I've been churning in my brain for a while of something I've wanted to do. The title is, quote, "Roses are hard to grow," unquote. How do we get here? How do we get out? This is basically, as we all know, this premise of roses are hard to grow. And that's what I began to talk about this. And I really wanted to have a conversation about how do we get into this conversation of roses are hard to grow and how do we get out of this constant loop that we seem to be spinning and spinning and spinning in. And it's not doing roses and the plant that we love really any good. I explored this with wonderful guests, Jason Crouch of Fraser Valley Rose Farm and Matt Douglas from High Country Roses. Jason runs Fraser Valley Rose Farm in British Columbia. He loves to grow the rare historical roses you just can't find in a typical garden center. He recently did a Rose Chat podcast on bourbon roses. I would advise you check that out. It's a great listen. He traded a 20-year retail career to study greenhouse production, working his way to head commercial grower, and then he built his own farm from scratch, which is Fraser Valley Rose Farm. You probably know him from YouTube. Wonderful YouTube channel, over 300,000 subscribers, and he gets to the basics of rose care, and I love his videos. He's just got a wonderful way of keeping it simple and presenting it extremely well. High Country Roses, Matt Douglas. Matt and I have been friends for over 20 years. He's the head rosarian there. He's the owner, chief bottle washer, propagator. I suspect Matt does a little bit of everything there. It's a mail order nursery, been in business since 1970, making it one of the older mail order rose nursery business still in existence in the United States. Over 850 varieties of own root roses, specializing in hardy roses for tough growing conditions, dedicated to the preservation of historic roses. So, really, two fun guests. And I asked them to be guests because I know they have opinions and not afraid to express their opinions. And that's what I wanted this show to be about, respectful opinions, but opinions, because I think we all have some on this. I believe all gardeners want to grow roses, but in many cases, they're intimidated by them because of their reputation over actually having tried them. It's their reputation. Matt, Jason, and I talk about how this came about. More importantly, is that reputation still relevant today? And what are some of the things that all of us, including you, who love and grow roses can do to encourage those folks who are intimidated by roses to come and grow the plant that we all love? So here we go. Matt and Jason, thank you so much for joining me on my A World of Gardening podcast. Welcome, Matt. Welcome, Jason.
Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So great. Love the new podcast. This is a really great forum for people.
It's a lot of fun. I was telling Jason earlier before we started, I kind of like the casual aspect of this as opposed to doing video, which we've all done. It's a fun thing to do. So I want to kind of get into this subject, and I asked both of you to join me because I know that you've talked about this, you have opinions on this, and I think it's kind of apropos right now. Roses are popular among gardeners, but we all three of us know that there's a lot of gardeners out there that I think would love to grow roses but are terrified.
Yeah,
I see
for
heads.
sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, Paul, I would just say I know we're going to jump into it, but I think a lot of it is, we've just placed some undue burdens on roses, frankly. I think there's certain people that have expectations of perfection or, what exactly is an easy grow rose or, how do they fit? What size? The rose is such a uniquely diverse plant and it can just be a little confusing and overwhelming to people. And, we just have a long history of having plants that just frankly weren't great.
And you're getting me into it. Yeah, Jason, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I want to echo what Matt was saying there there's a lot of expectations, but the fear. When I go selling, and I sell a lot in person at farmers markets, and probably 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 customers who approach me at the farmers market say some version of "I can't grow roses." And when I quiz them a little bit further, oftentimes I find that they've never even tried growing roses, but just that reputation has followed the roses along. My favorite quote on this topic came from a talk that Bill DeVore did to an American Rose Society club. And he said, the American rose industry has spent the last 100 years teaching their customers to be absolutely terrified of the product that they sell. So in that quote, he kind of put the blame squarely on the industry and saying, hey, we've kind of taught people you need pesticides, you need to, follow it up with a particular fertilizer regimen to be successful. You have to grow it a certain way. And is that a commercial opportunity? I suppose it is, but it also scares people about the expectations for roses.
And I agree. And it's funny that you mentioned that quote because that was on my brain as well. I was actually at that convention when he said that quote. And I almost stood up and gave him a standing ovation because I think it was like 2010, 11, somewhere in there. And I thought, that was so appropriate, in my opinion. So I think, and they have gotten that. So I think, and people, like you said, Jason, people come up here in the farmer's market and they say, well, I'm terrified of roses or I'm scared of roses. All three of us have gotten that. And I like to take it from their side and say, I get why you are. Because frankly, you've been fed a line of BS for 20 or 30 years out there that the industry has put out. And I think if we look at the message from the 80s and the 90s and even into the early 2000s, quite honestly, it made it so difficult. And so I think part of it is, and you alluded to this earlier, Matt, as well. So is it the messages that got us off track, or was it the roses that were being produced and bred that got us off track in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, or a combination of both? What do you guys think?
Oh, I would definitely go both. I think the difficulty is just the influx of all of those hybrid tea roses in the 60s, 70s, into the 80s that, were just based on genetics that, at least here in Colorado, really just don't thrive. They're just difficult to grow. These tea genetics are tropical plants. We're grafting them onto rootstock and trying to grow it in a zone 5 or a zone 4 even. And it was a recipe for disaster. I mean, for some reason we thought, that the perfect garden was all these tea roses with the little styrofoam cones on top of them. And, just miles of work and Lord knows what chemicals you were dumping into your yard. I remember all of that growing up. And it's not sustainable for the gardener. It's not sustainable for the environment. And I certainly don't think it's sustainable for the industry. Now, that said, fortunately, we've made such great strides towards plants that really do deserve to be in people's gardens. And that's part of our challenge too, is just really steering people towards the right plants.
Yeah, and I
So
think there's a moment when the message changed, and I want to jump to that in a little bit. We'll talk about that in a little bit.
yeah.
But I want to stay on a little bit on the theme. So, Jason, you've done some wonderful videos on all different kinds of roses. Like we talked about earlier, you just did one on bourbon roses for Rose Chat, which is a wonderful video. I mean, so if you look back at some of those roses from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even into the 90s, I mean, do you think, let me ask you guys a question. Should some of them have never seen the light of day?
Yeah, good question.
Cut to the chase.
I mean, that production system, I think the industry was in a boom. They had a demand for everything that was novel, big, colorful, showy roses of a particular form. And the fastest way to get there was to have a field full of grafted rootstock that you could turn on a dime, bud a whole bunch of new varieties on, and get them to market within a few years. My question for that era not only is to the preference of the roses and that idealized form of the rose, but also were they actually evaluating these before they got to market? Because that's what I'm seeing in some of those older rose varieties is I'm just like, man, I try to grow them and I just don't get good success with them. I wonder if, and I'm not trying to bash the grafted rose growers. Obviously, Matt and I are both own root rose growers. But the question of, did that production system become a crutch for putting a bunch of not so strong roses into the market very, very quickly?
Well, I think inherently, when you take a rose and put it on an artificial rootstock, you're admitting the rose can't survive on its own roots.
I
Yeah,
think you're
or
I mean that's a no brainer to me.
yeah.
To me, one of the key definitions of a vigorous rose is a rose that can survive on its own roots. If it can't, guess what? It's probably a piece of junk.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's definitely some of that, right? I mean, I think part and parcel of this whole argument, and as an own root rose grower, I would say I'm highly biased in these things because I grow, about 40,000 own root roses, and I love seeing them out in being grown that way. But, the one rose that I inevitably get 100 calls for a year is the peace rose, which is a beautiful rose. It's an iconic rose that has changed the industry and has done, more for promoting what we do today than probably any other plant. And it just doesn't grow well on its own roots. It really does not. It's an underwhelming and just kind of meh rose. It's and so it's really hard to have those conversations because of the expectations that are set. People want to grow those things they know, and what they know is a peace rose. They know a Mr. Lincoln rose. They know these classics that their grandparents grew, that their parents grew. And where we end up in trouble is then all of a sudden, from an own root standpoint, I'm producing a plant that's not as healthy as or as vigorous as something that's been grafted in the field. And frankly, that rose really needs to be on a graph to produce like it should produce. That said, I'd take one of like an enchanted piece that's on the market today. I can walk somebody up to that, show them an own root rose, almost identical in shape, color, and just 1,000 times more vigorous and just such a much healthier plant with better genetics. So that's kind of the challenge there, right? Is the standard that's set that's not totally attainable, and then the way we are trying to to meet it today.
Well, and I think that what you said, the standard that was set that's not totally attainable. And Jason, I'm going to go back to your comment about, you know, were these roses tested? Were they in the field?
Mm.
How were they tested in the field before they got there? So the old double ARS trials, All American Rose Selection trials, which was the trial, and certainly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they sprayed,
Mhm.
which is not a trial.
Right. Yeah, we had one of those beds here in town that I remember as a kid, my mother was working,
Yeah.
and it was, it was not a trial. I mean, it was a coddling of those plants just to see how they would grow in Denver, Colorado, you know.
Well, it was a
Mhm.
coddling, and then they would get the award, and the award would be issued. I mean, it was
Yeah,
a juggernaut in its day, double ARS.
sure.
But it did that. So,
And
s-
and beautiful plants for sure. Let's not sell them short in that regard. Those roses are amazing. And I think the question just really comes to the sustainability piece of it. I mean, is that something that's attainable and something that the average gardener can put in their yard, have it grow well, that they can enjoy year in and year out?
so that brings an interesting point on Matt and Jason. I'm going to ask you to address this first. So those were roses of an era,
Mhm.
60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And if you go back through roses have always had eras. There's the era of the bourbon rose, era of the hyperpetual rose, era of the Gallica, the China, and it moves on from there. Peace ushered in the modern hybrid tea as we kind of began to know it. So those roses were of that era. Should they perhaps be looked at, Jason, as something that was interesting for that era? And maybe some of them are kept around like Peace because there's some seminal history, and the rest of them, what should happen to them?
That's a great question. It gets right into my wheelhouse. My love of the old garden roses, my love of these eras of roses, the hybrid perpetuals before the hybrid teas, which had their own issues with exhibition qualities and everything else. I don't think, when we talk about, well, blame it on the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, that this was the time when roses got their reputation for being something that had to be perfect. I think we can go further back than that. I think American Beauty as a hybrid perpetual they were selling that for way more money than anything else because it was the most perfect rose ever grown. And that expectation that roses are perfect, that cultural expectation has slipped into pop culture. I mean, if you watch the Hunger Games series, what does President Snow grow? Perfect roses. If you look at the movie American Beauty, it's used as a symbol of something that's unattainably perfect. Even in old European kind of cultural history. You have the Virgin Mary was the Rosa Mystica, the perfect rose. So I don't think it's a brand new thing that roses are seen as unattainably perfect. And I think that the industry just followed that to some degree. But getting back to your original question, that doesn't mean that these roses from past eras are throwaways. I mean, I love a good Gallica, hybrid teas, bourbons, everything through that era of the high octane hybrid tea. I think it's a wonderful era. Big blooms, colorful, innovative, but can you grow them well? With a few exceptions, on their own roots, probably not for many of the ones that were introduced during that era.
Yeah, and I think I've always said, a friend of mine, the late Bob Edberg, who was a big Hyper Perpetual fan, he had catalogs and he amassed this thing. And he said at one point there was probably in the era of the Hyper Perpetual, which was really the first exhibition rose. I mean, that's why the Reverend Dean Hole sort of created the Royal National Rose Society around it. And he actually said there was, there may have been 4 or 5,000 Hyper Perpetuals in commerce at any one moment. We've all looked at old catalogs and seen what was there. And I'm with you. I mean, there are some from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. There are some beautiful hybrid teas out there. I mean, I grew Olympiad, the Sam McGreedy bread. That was a lovely, lovely rose. And I always feel to myself, we sort of hit this seminal change in 2001. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. And I think 50 years from now, people are going to be saying the best hybrid teas have survived. And
I
people are
would
going to go,
definitely agree.
gosh, those hybrid teas are fantastic. I can't believe they went away. Well, that's because the ones that were junk just faded away.
I definitely would agree with you there, Paul. And it's every once in a while we get somebody that wants to try to grow grandma's old rose or something like that, and they'll bring material in, and we have to just start and say, we're going to see how it does, right? Because it is no sure thing that, we're going to be
Yeah.
able to propagate and grow this rose as successfully as it was back then on its graft.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there is. It was funny. I was in a conference once with Peter Beals when he was still alive, and it was a World Federation Preservation Committee, and they were talking about preserving this rose and preserving that rose. And Peter could be a curmudgeon. And at one point, he actually looked up and he looked at everybody around the table and went, "Should we actually start thinking about whether some of these roses are actually worth saving? Would we be better
Mhm.
off just letting some of them die and go away?" I mean, chins hit the table at that point in time, and I think there is some possibility with that. So then let's kind of weave this thread in a little bit. So we know this that era that we're talking now, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, produced some gorgeous roses. We all agree with that. There are some stunners that were certainly in there. Some of them are probably worth keeping. But the message, the caretaking message of how to take care of them was kind of tailored to what was being grown at that time and what was on the market at that time. I'm going to pause there and Jason, let you start and see what, I mean, does that statement feel pretty accurate to you or push back on me?
No, I think that's exactly right, and let's combine that with the question of the hybrid tea is still the standard for form, for judging, for exhibition, and I think the exhibition culture of the time, even up till today, if you walk into a rose society at the time that they're having their show, they're showing off roses in a way that is idealized. They've disembodied these roses; it's just the head, they're judged on a point
Mhm.
system, fairly formal based on the perfection of the bloom, the perfection of the foliage, and any small kind of marring of that is a point off. And I think that when people see our hobby for the first time, and if that's what they see, those roses from that era and trying to be grown to perfection and being judged for perfection, I could see why somebody would turn away. I could see why somebody would look at that and say, maybe that's not for me. Likewise, when you see the formal rose gardens, roses not mixed but grown in geometric patterns, I love these rose gardens, but the way they look, maybe you'll have some boxwood around them, but basically geometric patterns with a block of color, all one rose, all stripped down to the knees, all perfectly maintained, many of them sprayed, no mixing. It's hard to keep roses that way, and I can understand why somebody who sees the rose industry or our hobby for the first time, let's not blame it on the industry fully, our hobby for the first time, they might feel intimidated by that.
That's such a great point, Jason. I'm so glad you brought up the Rose Show. And I'm heavily involved here with the Denver Rose Society, and we do a lot of outreach. One of the biggest opportunities we have each and every year is our Rose Show, where we interact with the public. People are in, and you know what they see? They see the queen of show. They see the court. And it's all of these hybrid tea roses, high centered, perfect looking roses. you know, Judging has gotten a little bit more diversified than just that. You'll see best in show that'll take in shrubs and other things. But you're right, and we'll get several hundred people come in the door, and I just there's always a part of me in my head that's thinking, what is the message we're sending as a rose society to these people that are like looking to get in and grow roses? I've heard so many great things over the past couple years of rose societies trying to make that rose show a little more accessible in terms of non-judged things and displays, and just really make it more of a celebration of roses. And I love that direction. I really love the way that lays out and really enables us to engage in those conversations about the roses that really deserve to be grown in gardens these days. And the other thing that I'm going to say that I think is very difficult for us in our industry is the cut flower business. people are accustomed to rolling into Costco or the grocery store and having, $20 worth of perfect 2-foot stemmed, tight, high-centered blooms. And that somehow conveys the message that that's the standard, right? At least in Colorado. I don't know about Paul in there in South Carolina or you up in the tropics of Canada. Here we don't get hybrid tea roses or any cut roses, that have got a 2-foot stem. It just doesn't happen. And so, I think again, it's really incumbent on us to set the expectations, especially in the industry, for people that are looking for roses, and again, allowing our customers and the people we interact with to know what to expect, and frankly, to be excited about what the roses can produce in their yards.
Yeah, and I think what you talk about there, the rose in the garden itself. I mean, rose shows, I don't exhibit. I haven't. I'm not against it. I had, particularly when I lived in Southern California, I had a lot of friends who exhibited who are very top exhibitors, some of the hardest working rosarians there are. I mean, that's a lot of work and skill to produce an exhibition
Mhm.
rose. But to me, it is an artificial expectation. The same, Rose Society convention that Jason quoted, Bill DeVore's quote, I gave the keynote speech. And I told one of the things I said was, I said, the problem is we as the American Rose Society are selling exhibiting as the ultimate goal. I said, exhibiting is not a starting point in rose growing. Maybe it's an end point for 5% of the rose growers.
Mhm.
But,
Mhm.
you have to understand, people have to understand the roses are not always going to be perfect. The Astral Blue Ridge Rose Society near me, they stopped doing a show.
Mm.
They do a rose exhibition.
Yeah.
And what they do in the North Carolina Arboretum, and I've been there several times and I've spoken up there, is everybody in the Rose Society and whomever brings in whatever old garden roses, new roses, modern roses. It doesn't make any difference. They don't have to be perfect. And they arrange them by class. And the goal is to show the diversity of the rose with these stems. And they get hundreds and hundreds of people through the door. And what they're doing is they're teaching about the diversity of a plant that, frankly, is to me the most amazing landscape plant on the planet in terms of the class. And I think that's kind of an interesting way to go. So it seems like just to button up, how we got here. It seems like we can say that we had some marvelous roses in that era of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. They took extra effort to grow, probably some chemicals and fungicides. A lot of that material is no longer on the market anymore, in my opinion, a very good thing that that's actually happened. So if we say, okay, that was an era. So if someone comes up and says, like you just said, Jason, you're at a farmer's market, and someone says, well, I can't grow roses. They're too complicated. I heard they're too complicated. Could we then say, okay, you're referring to an era that no longer exists?
Well, yeah, but at that point, you're arguing with a person who already has an impression of roses,
Sure.
and
Oh, good point.
yeah, you're trying to deprogram them on the spot with that, which I find is a pretty hard conversation to have. I mean, I accept where they come in from, and generally, what I like to have is a short list of roses that they can succeed with, or
Mm.
I mean, not to overrule them, but there are some roses that you can do really, really well with roses, and maybe starting with the question of how do we? I mean, I think everybody on this call has been talking to the public about roses for some time. Maybe we could talk about why roses are a high value plant to begin with. Why we chose roses. For me, when I came into gardening, obviously I wanted flowering plants, and annuals and perennials, they flower all season, and if you deadhead them, they'll repeat flowering. That isn't the case for most shrubs and trees, but shrubs, particularly when we're talking about roses, are usually once blooming. You get one bloom out of them in a year, and then they're done. So roses to me seemed like a super high value because they were something that could take up the space of the garden. You didn't have to start over again every year. They have that framework. And then as you need to, you can push them by pruning, by feeding, by watering, and you can get multiple flushes within a year, at least in my climate, where we have a longer growing season. So for me, they're like annuals or perennials with a big framework, with a lot of wood on them. And starting from that point of saying they are tough, you know, high performing shrubs, and the reason why I want to grow them is because they are high performing, then you can say, okay, now that high performance is a take it or leave it. You can put more effort into them and you can get more blooms. Or you can treat them like a regular shrub and get a little less from them. And there are ones that you can do without having to do all this to get what you need.
So then as a starter list, Matt, I mean, what Jason just brought up, if someone comes in and says, and Jason, a very good point about, we don't want to get into an argument because then people get defensive and we're not going to get anywhere with that. So I appreciate you raising that point. So then, Matt, if someone comes up and says, I've tried to grow roses, they're very difficult to grow, is perhaps a starter list of saying, these are roses that I've had success with. This is how I grow them. I think you'll have success. I mean, how do we then begin to change this message?
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, anybody that comes into our nursery, I encourage everybody that it deals with people to have sort of in their back pocket 4 or 5 different varieties that they're excited about and that we know are good performers, especially in the climate locally here. But the biggest thing I always preach to my folks is you've got to really listen and you got to really hear what people want. Because, like Jason was just saying, roses are amazing. They can fit literally anywhere in your landscape. I mean, if you want something for a patio pot, we've got something for a patio pot. If you want something to grow 30 feet up in your tree, we'll take you back and show you some of the ramblers. You know, there is such a diversity of shapes, sizes, colors, you know, applications for all of these roses. And I think it's very important for us to have the ability to interface with the people that come in our doors or that we talk to, hear what they truly are looking for. Sometimes it's as easy as a color, right? And you just
Yeah.
got to know, yeah, we've got this rose in this color that would be great for you. And there are roses for everybody that loves a different color. Let's be honest. Some I don't like, but other people love, or people want something that's fragrant. Thank goodness fragrance has become so much of a breeding priority for people, for breeders in the last, few decades. People love to stick their nose in a rose. So you've got to just be able to interface, and whether it's through like a website like most of our customers do, or if it's face to face, you have to make that information available to the consumer so that they can find what matches what they want and the application they have in mind for the rose in their yard.
So is part of the way then we begin to, move out of this and get people to grow roses, which is what we all want. I've always said for years that I think every gardener on the planet wants to grow a rose.
Mhm.
And either they were intimidated and never started, Jason, going back to what you said earlier, or they were maybe didn't purchase an easy growing rose to begin with and tried and gave up. So we talked about expectations that people walk into a rose show and there's that beautiful high pointed centered hybrid tea with the foliage that looks like it's been polished and all that. So does the industry, and I mean, I'm talking media, I'm talking everybody, do we have to manage expectations? And I'm going to throw out a sentence. Do we have to lower expectations?
I think we have to decatastrophize the idea
Ooh,
of,
I love that word.
yeah. Yeah, when somebody thinks, I'm a bad person because I let black spot go onto the leaves of my rose, or
Yes, you will be banned from rose societies. Your secateurs will be taken away. You're a horrible human being.
that's right. Some people get sashes and some people get stood in the corner, because they grew too much black spot on their roses. And I think the idea that the rose has to be perfect, that's one thing, but also just let's talk about that in real terms. Every good performing plant in the landscape, if it's growing tomatoes, tomatoes have pests. If you're growing, cucumbers, cucumbers have pests. It doesn't mean it's not worth growing tomatoes or cucumbers. It does mean that you have to learn something as you go along, but also that we can say to people, it's not an emergency the first time you see aphids on a rose. Aphids are a pretty widespread pest. They show up on everything, and it isn't a failure or personal failure if you see a slight imperfection in the garden.
It's true. And, frankly, these days I talk to young people that are super concerned with how roses fit into the grander, food web landscape that they're planting in their yards, you know? I mean, as people move away from grass, especially here in Colorado, want more low water plants, want more of a managed natural landscape. You're right on the money there, Jason. We need to be able to talk to them not only about not having perfect roses with a few bugs on them, but roses that can actually be hosts to insects and just part of the greater environment.
They are part of the greater ecosystem. And you mentioned food earlier and tomatoes. I mean, I had tomatoes on our property here in South Carolina. I had them sort of in a separate vegetable garden when we got here, and I would get, tomato hornworm and things like that. And one year, just for the heck of it, I actually planted amongst all my roses and all my perennials.
Mm.
No problems at all. There
Right.
was so much bird and so much wildlife in there just going
Mhm.
after every single thing. So, yeah, I agree. I think, you know, you know, like you said, Jason, decatastrophe. It's a great word, by the way. I'm gonna
Mhm.
I'm gonna steal that one from you. But it is a real truth. I mean, I think telling people, like I tell people in South Carolina, in July and August, I get hot and humid, and I tell people, in that period of time, my roses don't look good, but that's okay.
Mhm.
That's a good time to come in and groom and work with them a little bit. So it sounds like, I mean, I think if we begin to tell people, okay, the roses don't have to be perfect, make sure they get a good rose. I mean, I think we maybe on our way to sort of changing the conversation a little bit there.
Yeah, and I think all of us have social media reach, and I think that's one thing that has democratized roses to some degree. I mean, it used to be that there was a kind of a flow of information that came from the industry down through the media and through rose societies, but now we're talking with each other a lot. And I
Mhm.
think that's a great thing. You go on to the Facebook groups and you do I'm talking directly to people through my YouTube videos, and if they hear me talking about black spot, almost every time I say about black spot, it's like it's mainly cosmetic. Now, it doesn't mean you can't have a severe case of black spot or powdery mildew, but typically it's cosmetic, and people just need to know that this is not the end of the world, and that I deal with it all the time. And that the thing I do is I do a little bit of defoliation, some pruning for openness in the center of the shrub. Maybe I'll pick up some sulfur, which is not a hard chemical or something that's going to be damaging to the environment. But that's about it. And just to know that it's down to earth, that we're just regular people, that our rose gardens are not perfect, that they're going to see my roses not staged perfectly as for an exhibition or in a one species rose garden, but they're going to see my roses mixed with other perennials and other annuals and even into your veggie garden or into people who do mixed plantings tend to, my feeling is, have more success because there's not so much emphasis on the one plant, and you also have more beneficial insects around overall if you've got some catmint and yarrow and other things that promote those beneficial insects in the garden with your roses instead of 100 feet away, because the roses have to be grown alone, of course, is what the cultural thing would say, right?
Yep.
And which it sounds like I'm bashing on the old tradition of the dedicated show rose garden, and I'm not. I think these are grand old traditions. I think, and like you said about rose shows, Matt, that this is a wonderful time for us to reach out to the community, and they're going to see the hobby. The only proviso there is the thing both of you have said is we just have to be cognizant of what it says about our industry if we form it a certain way. So when we go on social media, not trying to be too perfect, we're showing the roses the way they're actually used in the garden. I think we can beat this, keeping in mind, of course, that we have like 2,000 years of cultural history with roses that we're trying to move the needle on. It's probably not going to be you or I or you that actually finishes this conversation.
Yeah, but I agree with you completely. And I think what you talked about showing sometimes the flaws in the garden. I've done a couple videos where I've wandered through my garden when it's not looking its best, and there is some black spot and some yellow leaves, even with weeds. And I got very interesting feedback the first time I did it. People wrote back and they said, "Oh my God, we always thought your garden was amazing. We thought your garden would be spotless, because you're supposed to be, quote unquote, this whatever attainable." And they said, "I love the fact that your garden doesn't look great either. I feel so much better about my own now."
Yo, it's so true, Paul. I had the Rose Society out to my house so they could see my yard. And, I live sort of in suburban Denver and it's a young landscape. You know, my roses are like 2 feet tall because I'm constantly cutting them back to take material in for propagation back at the greenhouse. You know, there are weeds everywhere in my yard, but this is a great opportunity, especially for that group, for them to come in and see, hey, Matt, who's, a professional at this, even his yard looks the same way. There's black spot, there's aphids, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I, for one, love that sort of feel to the garden. It's just a very real living thing that we're fortunate enough to be a part of. I get where the tradition has sort of said that we need to sort of manufacture this space. But there is some happy medium for everybody, right? Some people definitely want an integrated rose garden. Some people do still want to have very lined out, manicured gardens. And the good news is I feel like our industry has done a good job in the past couple decades of providing varieties that will not only survive, thrive, and really produce no matter what style of garden you're really looking for.
Yeah, I agree, Matt, and I think what you just said is important. I mean, I think it's so the way that roses were grown, Jason, you talked about it, necessarily, on their own, and they were, in this bedded out kind of format. I always tell people, that's a way to grow roses. It's not a right way, it's not a wrong way, it's a way. And if that's your way, go for it. But I think then what we can begin to do is to say, okay, that is a way to grow roses, but there's other ways,
Mhm.
integrated with perennials, not necessarily perfect. Maybe there's going to be some weeds. Maybe there's going to be some insect damage. So, I think broadening the conversation of how roses are grown, I think will help a lot and give people permission to put a rose or roses in their garden and go out there in the evening and say, oh my gosh, it's not perfect. Well, that's okay. So let's then kind of go into this thing because I like to get practical with some things like this. So here we are, the three of us. We are now facing the person who is skeptical about growing roses, whether it be through social media, we're facing them in person, whatever like that. What are some practical tools that we could potentially give them to say, okay, you want to succeed with roses. We want you to succeed with roses. We all have a common goal. So here's some resources, some tools that we can potentially use to make sure you get off to a good start.
I think there's a lot of things still at play there. I think the rose societies still have a role to play. I know that they're sort of the local societies have definitely got a changing role. I know here in Denver, we struggle a little bit with attracting people to a traditional meeting. So we've branched out with, video conferencing, social media, those sorts of things. You got to kind of meet the people where they are from the Rose Society side of it. I think it's important for us as retailers to really do a good job. We send with every rose we send out, we send a very detailed kind of getting started directions. We try to knock those barriers down as much as possible and make people comfortable with the plants they're purchasing. I think the online resources, though, are the single greatest change over the past decade or so towards the community of rose growing. I mean, honestly, the conversation about roses has really moved almost completely online. Jason obviously sees that with his YouTube channel. You see it all across your social media, but, you know, a Facebook group like the Rose Geeks, they have more interaction between experienced growers and new growers than any other format I can even imagine. And it is a very powerful way to encourage people and really get the message out about growing roses. Honestly, these forums have really become our greatest sounding board and our greatest advocate for growing roses,
Yeah,
and, it's great.
yeah, I think the Facebook groups can. I mean, I've got the one that I have, and mine
Mhm.
is designated a safe space. No questions
Yeah,
too basic, no questions too
yeah.
simple. But let's be honest. you've all been on a Facebook group and someone posts a picture of, is this new growth or is this rosette disease? And someone inevitably comes on and slams and go, well, you should know that. You're stupid. And you
Mhm.
know what? They're out of my group in 16 seconds. That is the worst attitude we can possibly have. So, Jason, again, now you're standing at the farmer's market. This person walks up again. And I'm going to keep going back to that analogy because I like that one. It's a real personal one-on-one contact. And so the person then says, okay, I'd love to try to grow a rose. Then what are some tools that you would then begin to encourage them in a positive way to say, okay, here's your first step. Here's your first step towards what we know is a wonderful addiction.
Well, I think you want to put a rose in their hands that they're going to succeed with, and I have a handful locally here that are, outstanding. You have a lot of the Cordes roses. If I had South Africa on hand, they like orange or orange yellow. I think they're going to succeed with it. Same thing. If they wanted a yellow, let's go with Julia Child. And there's a brighter orange one called Fellowship, or I guess they call it as Living Easy in the U.S. Daybreaker. I mean, there's so many wonderful roses that if I have them with me on hand, I want to get them in their hands and then give them the basic instructions of how to get them into the garden. And a lot of that is now handled. I mean, I don't repeat myself many times because I have all the videos. And so that's literally the whole genesis of my YouTube channel was trying to answer questions for people from the farmers market. And I don't want to have to keep on selling. So what I do is I hand them onto my YouTube channel, and then they get the instructions on how to plant and how to prune and so on and so forth. Go back to what you were saying about the rosette disease. Having those forums and having that question is never going to stop being asked. Is this bright red new growth? Is that fresh growth from my rose, or is that rosette disease? And you'll see people asking that questions 15 years from now, 20 years from now, 30. It's going to keep on happening. Likewise, I don't think I'm ever going to stop identifying Dr. Huey for people. I think that's you know it's
Well,
out
if
there.
if we Jason, if we go en route, that day may come.
That's who it come, but for it, we've got a lot of rootstock out there, and it's going to keep on expressing, and so having these open lines of communication are so important. I wanted to just touch back on what Matt was saying about the Rose Geeks. I mean, we know Kimberly, and she has a particularly good mind and her community of really engaging with people where they live and getting down to, you want to know the precise schedule of what I do? Let's talk about that precise schedule. I don't do that. A lot of times, if you go to my YouTube channel, it's a little more bare bones and a little more, this is why you're doing it. But I don't get into writing a schedule for them or holding their hands through it. I think it takes different kinds. It takes different kinds of people in the community. Some people are going to gravitate a little bit more to my approach, a more casual, less structured approach, and some people really, really want that step by step scheduled. This is what you feed and when and how and so on. Just like you said, not everybody's going to end up on the show table. That's just one endpoint for the hobby, or not everybody's going to grow a formal rose garden. That's one endpoint for the hobby. It's also true that everybody's approach to the hobby is a little bit different just based on how they're wired.
And that's a great point, Jason. I mean, what you just basically said is the ways of approaching the hobby of growing roses is as diverse as the roses themselves.
Totally agree, and that's where our job comes in, is to make those matches, right? We got to match those roses that fit the hobby style and the growing style, and thankfully we've got a lot of roses at our disposal to do just that.
Yeah, and so much of it is local, Jason. You touched on that. You have roses that do well locally for you, and that is such a key because for so long it was a bit the industry did, and I've been part of the industry for 20 years, so I'm happy to talk about this. It was kind of this myth that every rose does well everywhere, which is not true, and that's true with any plant. And I look at tools like, for example, the American Garden Rose Selection Trials and American Rose Trials for Sustainability, regional
Mhm.
trials. So now we're getting a regional approach to growing roses. And it's okay, I think, for the industry to say, yeah, this is a lovely rose in these climates, but if you live in this kind of climate, it's maybe not the best rose for you there either. So I think local information becomes important. Some final thoughts here, I think. So it's kind of neat. I think what we've talked about here is a little bit in the beginning of It was a wonderful era for roses in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Some beautiful roses were produced. Some of them, not all of them, did take a little bit of extra care, which was fine for that era and that moment in time. Jason, as you pointed out, it went back a lot further than that. I'm sure whoever grew the first perpetual was hard at work, unless they lived in London, which was the air was full of sulfur back in the day. but but I think that's the truth, and I think now we're kind of in a different era now, with certainly since 2000s and 2000, and as you said, the new genetics, Cortez, and even genetics being produced. Ping Lim is producing phenomenal roses out there that are there. And so now we have this broad diversity. If you want to grow roses in the older style, you can. If you want to grow roses in the newer, more casual styles we're talking about, they're out there. So I think the opportunities are there for everyone, really, that are to really grow and engage in this hobby in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and our job becomes being that first step in, that inspire people with photos and pictures and videos.
So, Jason, are you calling us a gateway drug?
Yes, I literally am. Or if if we're doing our job properly, influencers and vendors are the front line of introducing people to the images, to talking about the fragrances. Even if you can't smell it through the screen, you can hear it. You can hear what's important to you. And how many people have gotten into the hobby because they saw something cool on Instagram. Or like it is something that draws people. We are fortunate. I mean, I'm going to say wrap up my part by saying it's a double-edged sword. We talk about, oh my goodness, all this cultural baggage that roses have had, but who's talking about hostas the way that they're talking about roses? You know what I mean? Like, people are not certainly there are people who are keen on hostas, but they don't have that 2,000 years of cultural history. They don't put them into movies as a symbol of perfection. So here we are. We have this wonderful opportunity and can build on the fact that our culture already loves roses. It just got some bad ideas about what they were and how to grow them. Is all.
Matt, your thoughts on that?
It's still the queen of the garden, right?
Yeah, it is. Greatest plant out there.
And the good news is the queen of the garden doesn't have to look exactly like the queen of show in the rose show, right? So I totally agree with what Jason is saying, and you, Paul, and it's a great era to be growing roses because there has just been fantastic leaps in terms of disease resistance, in terms of blooming power, variety of color and size. You know, you know, the industry has done a good job of hearing some of the recent complaints about roses and is answering a lot of those complaints with fantastic plants. I'm with you guys completely, and that I'm just really, really encouraged and excited about the future of roses. There's so many young people that we come into contact with every day that are excited about growing roses. And you know what? Frankly, I hear less and less that it has to look just like grandma's old garden and, staked out and perfect. And, if I see another rose cone, I'll be surprised. But the double-edged sword is a little bit true, and so it's a loved plant, and form is an important part of that love, and the trick is really being able to meet the w- the consumer's needs and just really deliver the plants that are going to do for them what they would like the roses to do.
Yeah, and I think you used the word plants several times in the last sentence, which I like, as opposed to the word roses,
Mm.
because at the end of the day, it is a plant.
Mhm.
Yeah, and if you can grow a plant, you can grow a rose plant because it's really no different at the end of the day. So, gentlemen, this has been great. I really appreciate the conversation. And I always like to leave one last question. So, Jason, you love roses, your videos, everything talks about it. Was there a moment in your life that you went looking at roses and said, "Oh, this is so much more than just a plant. There's something, now I'm falling in love," and that's because?
Strangely for me, there was a time in history when other people were stepping back from roses. I was falling in love with them. And what I saw was there were Canadian suppliers that were dropping off the market and disappearing, and with them, a lot of the old rose varieties that I was still looking for. Their collections were going away, and it just struck me in let's say, a sentimental place where I said, you know what? If other people are stepping away from the hobby, I need to step in a little bit and build my collection and start propagating. So I think it was, I mean, I was falling in love, but I think part of what I was doing was I was reacting to a cultural moment when roses were on a bit of a decline. And I decided I better go and do something with that. And that's kind of what cemented my direction in the industry. Certainly I went on to grow perennials professionally and do other things, but roses were my first love in the industry. And other people stepping away from roses was my cue to step in.
Matt, what about you? A heart moment.
Well, I would say roses, or I didn't choose roses. Roses chose me. I always like to say I was conscripted into the rose business as a teenager, and I'll be honest, I didn't love it back then. It was just a lot of hard work in the sun to get to something else, and we obviously loved working in the yard as a family and whatnot. But I would say I didn't really truly learn to love roses until I came back into the business in my mid late 30s. Once I kind of got my bearings running the business, I just looked around and I said to myself, "Man, this is not a bad way to make a living." And I really, really do love the roses. And that people always ask me what my favorite rose is, and I always say it is always changing, and it is 100% true because I love each and every one of them for a different reason. And honestly, I can't even imagine, living without these plants. They're just such joy-giving, life-giving things for me.
Yeah, the same way when I'm around. I mean, people always ask me about, roses and what I do, and I always say I love what I do. I love what I do because I love roses, and my saying is, it could be worse. I could actually have a job, which I don't. But and I
Every
think,
once in a while, it feels like a job, Paul. Every
oh,
once in a while.
I used to own a nursery. I know there are times when it's a job.
It's
Yeah, no,
usually it's
and
usually the accounting side that's way more
yeah,
it's way
yeah,
worse.
and even now for me, there's times when it's definitely a job. But the reason I wanted to ask that question, because I think what I wanted to let people know out there that there is a lot of information about growing roses, and we've talked about the information here about how what your goal is and things like that. But to me, ultimately, at the end of the day, a rose is not a head plant; it's a heart plant. And I think that's why people love them so much because they appeal more to the heart than I think they appeal to the head. So what I would like people to take away from this is yes, grow roses and read information and stuff like that, but grow them from your heart because that I think is really what's going to help you succeed because you can't go wrong if you approach it that way.
Absolutely. I mean, they're like little tiny time machines. It takes you right back to growing with your parents or your
Yeah.
grandparents, or you think of a place you were or a scent you experienced. They are truly a fantastic endeavor.
Jason, any last thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm glad we had the conversation. This is something that I know you've been taking the lead on, Paul. From the time I started getting into the business and the social media end of things. Just saying, roses are just plants. Let's demystify them. Let's get the fear out of the equation and put them into people's gardens for the right reasons. Because you love them, because you want the fragrance of them, because they can do so much. I mean, that's that. If there's anything, it's that thing of why are they worth growing? Because they bloom all the time. They have wonderful forms, wonderful colors. You can grow them as a climber. You can do so many things with roses. So I think you're right. Start with why you love roses. You don't have to do a lot of convincing after that.
And I think, Jason, that's a perfect way to button this up. So, Jason and Matt, thank you so much for joining me on the World of Gardening podcast. I've loved this conversation.